Welcome to Have You Heard, where we talk about issues at the intersection of agriculture and engineering. Let's get started. Here are your hosts, Morgan Hayes and Josh Jackson.
Welcome. This is the Have You Heard podcast. This is episode 73. Josh and I are back after many technical difficulties here. I'm Morgan Hayes, an assistant professor in biosystems and agricultural engineering here at the University of Kentucky, focusing on livestock facilities and in my personal life in Louisville County, Kentucky with my
I'm Josh Jackson, assistant professor in biosystems, agriculture, and engineering as well. And in where I focus on precision livestock farming, and in my personal life, raise vegetarian cattle, some goat production, and also a little bit of hay.
Okay, Josh. So we're getting started here today. Hopefully we are back in business. We've been really struggling with some technical difficulties here, connection issues and some other things, and hopefully we have better audio. Just in case, we'll record this, and hopefully that will guarantee us at least something that we can work off of in the future if we need.
Yes.
Aside from that, our topic for today is going to be our farm financials. We recorded this about a month ago, and no audio with it. So we're going to retry and record it and repost it here. We've had a very wild couple months. I was traveling, you had a baby, the holiday season, lots of things have been happening. And so as we sort of are coming back into the picture here, we're going to sort of give ourselves a moment here to just sort of reflect on 2023, because I had a pretty good idea in early January what our farm financials were. But now at the beginning of February, we have finished our record book for 2023. Everything that goes into our tax forms is now in there. So I probably have better insight to actually reflect back on 2023 at this point than I did last time. Before we do all of that, let's just give a quick update what's been happening on the farm for the last week, 10 days, something like that.
Let's see. So we were getting pretty low on hay, and we're able to move some hay home from another farm. So we've had a little bit of a dry spell. It was a little damp this weekend, but it was actually dry enough to move some hay. So we got about 144 bales moved home, which will pretty much get our fall herd probably through most of March.
Good.
So that'll get us feeling a little better. And then we also moved a couple bales for our spring herd, so that'll get them also through March. So pretty much moving hay to locations where we can actually get to it and feed it a little easier. So at that point, our hay barns were empty, so just getting those barns filled back up from the other farms. And then just with that, pretty much we're feeding a lot of hay still, going through it and just monitoring and managing animals and getting ready for potential weaning maybe after farm show.
Yeah, we, similar to you, are feeding a lot of hay. It's just that time of year. We actually traveled last week. My husband and I both traveled to a trade show down in Atlanta, Georgia, and figuring out how to be gone at this time of year is very tricky. For one of us to be gone is tricky. For both of us to be gone is extremely difficult. It's a lot of preparation and getting hay in the right spots, which fortunately we were able to do. Other than that, we continue to feed hay. The strategy of feeding hay, especially on farms that don't have feeding areas, but that you don't really want to tear up the ground, finding that balance between those two. This dry spell we're getting here behind a very wet week is really good.
Yep.
I would say we had almost 6 inches of rain the week before last, making it very muddy for a few days, but it is drying out, which is good. On the other hand, I think we could still use more rainfall to get ourselves our groundwater where it needs to be. So we'll accept more rain if we have to. It's not a bad thing, but a couple frozen days at some point in late February or early March would be really helpful for putting the last of the hay out that needs to go out so that we can graze it more strategically without having to tractor each and every day when it's that wet.
Right.
Aside from that, we sold calves in early January, so we have no weaned calves currently to feed, other than a couple steers that are going in for finishing next week.
All right. And that kind of almost leads into the financial aspects we were talking about before was, when you sold those calves, that was part of the strategic decision, I think, for 2023 versus 2024 is like when you sold those calves.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, we typically will sell 2 groups each year, a fall and a spring group. That is a pretty standard, but we were prepared to sell those calves a little bit earlier. They were growing well, the prices were okay just before Christmas, but we held them up until the second week of January when there was a market to sell them in, specifically because we didn't want to have all 3 groups go on our taxes for 2023. Right now, cows are high, inputs are high, but the offset is better if you sell the same number year after year rather than having one year where you have this huge surplus of money. So we did hold them up until January and then sold them then. Typically, we would run these calves out into sometime into February or even early March before selling. But with hay prices where they are and the demand that we have for people to purchase hay, we decided to be conservative and protect our hay supply and sell them a little bit earlier. And no regrets on that. That was I think a
Right.
good decision.
Plus, when we had that cold spell and everything else, it's really putting a strain, I think, on everybody's hay supplies in this
Yeah.
weather.
Yep, absolutely. The cold puts a supply crunch in a little bit. People start to go through hay much faster. They makes them nervous. But then we turned around and right behind it we had a warmer spell, but with a lot of rain and mud. And mud is the other thing that causes hay to go out the door very quickly.
Yep.
In fact, we actually found that our cattle were utilizing more hay with the rain than they did with the cold snap, which is interesting. We gave them, I'd limited them free choice hay in both scenarios, but they actually utilized more with the rain and the mud than they did with the cold.
I think that's just because they're having to fight through the mud. Most
I would think
likely,
so.
extra energy to fight through the mud.
I think that's exactly right. On top of which, if they were able to pull out a big mouthful and they had some pieces dropped, they could go back and eat them on frozen ground. Whereas in the mud, they disappear immediately. You can't even figure out how much wastage you're getting. For people that are in the upper Midwest, you sort of know how much wastage there is because you can see the hay on the ground after you can't find the hay in the mud.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not only is it not on the ground, it's not even in the top 6 inches of mud. It's
Yeah.
8-10 inches down, and it's really hard to figure out how much wastage you actually have when you're not feeding on rock or concrete.
No, no. For us, we'd cleaned off our pads so we could kind of make it less of a challenge
Right.
when we had that cold spell. But yeah, it's definitely something to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you look at your 2023 financials, was it a good year, a bad year?
For us, it was a decent year. I would like for it to have been better. We did have, so I mentioned, I think throughout the podcast that we had a tractor in the shop, so I knew that we got it back, right at the end of December, right at December there. So that was took it on the chin.
Having a tractor out of commission for a whole season that is a tough thing to swallow.
It's a challenge, and also getting that bill
Sure.
was the challenge, and so we knew that repairs were probably going to eat up a lot of what we could have had in profit. I think was one of the challenge. We know not every year you're going to be redoing a clutch, but there is a cost that we just assume, kind of like the ASAB standard for repairs. We assume that the total value of our equipment, 5-10% of that is going to be just allocated for repairs, and so we know that's a cost that we could incur.
Yeah.
And so that was just one that was a little higher than we thought it should have been. But it wasn't. All in all, it was a good year. We sold a number of animals. Had a fairly good and consistent revenue stream. Wasn't quite as diversified as we would have liked. So, I think you guys have found that maybe selling meat, I think has been a promising proposition.
Yeah.
And so we know that's true, but just getting a good consistent supply for us, in addition to all the other management aspects we're trying to accomplish, is everybody's pulled a little thin.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the reality is that the more we diversify, the thinner we get stretched. That is a reality. For us, what we see is that we hold those calves an extra year to get them to finishing for meat, but there is a margin associated with that, and we're making it. Right now, that we've talked to a couple neighbors and some about their pricing and stuff, and some of them feed differently and they have a different price point that they try to hit, but I think at the end of the day, we have to set the price based upon the management that we want to do, the style of feeding, the quality of the meat that we want to produce, and just rock on with a system that's working for us, but that we are confident we have a consistent product coming. That's really important. The last thing we want to do is
Yep.
create inconsistent product trying to get that cost down. So we know we're not the cheapest. I also know we're not the most expensive on the market, and we're comfortable with that, and that we might not be growing fast at the moment, but that we get repeat customers and stability on those sales. Ideally, we can kind of over time work ourselves up until eventually we could potentially do maybe half or all of our steers
Okay.
as direct market meat. That would be really nice. The
Yeah.
margin is better.
Yep.
I will say that it is a little bit of a funky balance because the first couple years you just are holding back 5, 6, 8 calves and not selling them when you sell your groups. So your profit for the first few years, or while you're growing in general, you're always sort of having a couple less animals than you should be when you sell because they take an extra year to make it to the market.
Like you're playing catch up those first couple years, and
Yep,
yeah.
it's exactly right. But now that we're sort of at a number and we're growing, but much more slowly, starting to look a little bit better on the books. Those numbers are also a little tricky because if you sell whole animals, it's not so bad. If you sell parts and pieces, figuring out how to account for that in your books is a little bit tricky. We're very diligent because we sell hay. We have inventory sheets in our record books.
Yep.
So we know how much hay comes in, how much hay goes out, and how much hay we utilize. And then we have to balance the LLC handles the hay sales from a liability. All the hay goes through the LLC, but our personal hay use, we then have to pay the company for, or the company pays us depending on the balance of purchased hay versus self rolled hay that we ourselves have rolled. So
Right.
that's sort of an interesting dynamic. I don't know how other people use their record books. There's a couple different software packages out there. We weren't happy with any of them when we first looked, and we built our own Excel workbook that it has everything in it. So for our hay sales, our sales tax calculations are in there, plus all of our equipment, our repairs, our
Right.
materials, all of it's in there, but also inventories. And we've been able to inventory hay well, but inventorying meat is a much trickier process. So if anyone has suggestions for me, I would welcome some assistance with figuring that out.
Yeah, because meat, it is challenging because I think post COVID, had more people interested in potentially the meat aspects, but getting a quarter or even a half, that's still a lot of meat for people.
Yep.
So a whole animal is almost impossible.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we have transitioned is to a USDA certified processor because we've moved away from wholes and halves and moved into parts and pieces. And so, for safety's sake, we have moved ourselves into a USDA plant, which is necessary. That is
Yeah.
the appropriate decision, but it does make the dynamic of how we account for all of it a little bit trickier. So we're still sort of figuring out how to keep record of that because we also eat off of those animals that we process. I mean, not the quarters and the halves and the wholes, but when we process an animal for parts and pieces, we might choose to eat a piece of it,
Right.
have burger or something like that, and just making sure that we know what we're taking and what we're selling. And if we're utilizing that meat, we don't want that to come across as us not making money because we essentially are making money by eating our own meat. It's just not a cash
Not part
line
of the
item
cash flow. Yeah.
necessarily. Or if it is, that we should be accounting for it as though we were paying for the meat that we're eating, which that's a picking pennies and tossing them back and forth. It's just exchanging money between ourselves, but just trying to keep the record book clean is a little trickier.
Yeah. I mean, even for us, just really keeping detailed, almost equipment. For us to be the equipment record and
Yeah.
just trying to analyze, really how much equipment are we actually using? Which one of piece of equipment actually utilizing the most? Which ones are incurring the greatest cost, but do they also have the greatest hours?
Yes.
And just making sure that if those two match.
Yeah, that's a very fair that understanding the cost to maintain versus the cost to use. This last year we made the decision to sell one of our trucks, a big truck that we use for hauling hay, because we kept looking at it and our usage was not very high, but the maintenance cost on a larger diesel engine truck is not insignificant. I mean, you have 4 very large batteries, and trying to keep them all charged if you aren't running it on a daily or at least multi-time a week, it becomes really challenging. And so we had to make the decision that it wasn't getting enough use, that we had to sell it. And I don't regret that decision, but sometimes it hurts when you have something that you really like as a piece of equipment, but you just don't utilize it enough to justify.
We were kind of the same way with the backhoe. So
Yep.
we ended up selling our backhoe this year, and we all love the backhoe, but we just looked at it as like hour wise. We weren't putting a lot of hours on the backhoe, and then we looked at it as well. It's like, well, there is a significant cost just because it's all the piece of equipment, just keeping everything maintained and functional.
Yep.
So that's a lot of hydraulics, a lot of hydraulic hoses, a lot of stuff that can be expensive.
Yep. So I think that that's a fair assessment. This year, also, the other thing I'd say on the record books that were interesting in is we had a couple pretty significant windstorms. I don't know how that worked out for you, but we had some damage from them. So we have repair costs on barns and things like
Yep.
that. Some of that was insurance covered, some of it was self covered, a little bit of both. And so there are some pretty big costs. I like you would say that our year was in general good, but not excellent.
Considering the cattle prices.
Considering cattle prices, we were able to show small profits. Actually, our cattle don't really show a profit this year, which is kind of interesting. Thinking that has to do with a couple of those the calves that were sold as meat that haven't yet made it out the door. Just the way our books go, we haven't yet rectified that inventory number, which is, I think, part of our challenge. But cattle didn't show huge. Hay showed some profit, which is not a surprise. Hay prices are high this year. They were high last year.
Yeah.
And just making sure we make our margin, we seem to do okay as long as we're pretty cognizant of the price it comes in at and making sure the price it goes out at is the right one. But that all of that, a lot of that profit, small amount from cattle, which is fairly small, and from the hay, a lot of it was eaten up by repairs on barns and then also new fencing, so new infrastructure, which the good news is that will be a depreciation over years.
Yeah.
If I look at the book in terms of the year standalone, it doesn't look great for us, but because we'll be able to depreciate out the new fencing over, I think it's 7 or 15, which one I don't think fences go to 20.
I thought
It might be a 15-year depreciation. All of our depreciation is stretched out. We've been doing lots of fencing, so our accountant will help us do our best, to be honest, and hopefully I'm not causing the look at me closely. But yeah, I think that those types of things make a pretty big difference.
And the fencing for me, we always just view it as like it's a investment in hopefully making the operation easier.
Yep.
To me, if you're not having to worry about trees falling down, if you're not having to, you clean the lines, and hopefully the cattle, you're avoiding potential liabilities in the future.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that is a good way to think about it. I don't mind spending money on the infrastructure on the farm. In fact, I believe in it. You and I go out and do a lot of talks about infrastructure on farms. In fact, I did one on fencing and watering systems last night. I'm a big believer in investing in them, but we do have to acknowledge that there is a cost associated with them, and
yeah,
it can be quite significant. And so just making sure that our record books reflect that.
And we kind of similarly, we did do a lot of fencing this past year, but I know this upcoming year is going to be a big year for fencing for us. And so it's just we weren't able to get things lined out last year, and so this next year was like, well, it's going to have to happen this year.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair. The other thing I'll say about cattle that was interesting this year is we bought new breeding stock, new bulls.
Oh.
So we had new bulls come in. We sold old bulls, which covered a portion of it, but the new bulls came in, and we bought a new male alpaca. So on our livestock totals, we have a lot of money into genetics that should pay out in the future. But at this point, it's just a large flux of money that went out the door where we haven't yet seen the rewards for the
for that
payment made, I guess. Also part of I call it my cattle number, but my cattle is all my livestock. It's not, I don't have them separated by species. You have your goats on a completely different book than your cattle?
So the goats, yeah, they're separate. So the goats are separate just from the fact that a lot of it's run through my brother and sister-in-law, but the majority of them are going through there, and then they're getting a percentage of that from my share for the goats. And then the other aspect is we're still building the herd. So a lot of it is we're still trying to, so the goats, they do well, but we could be doing better, but we're not to the point, we're still in a growth phase in essence.
Right.
So we're, building, I think 60, 80, we want to get to at some point 200 be kind of our goal initially. And so we're still taking some of those, keep retaining some of the does and marketing as many as we can as far as the little bucks and trying to maintain some of our income with that. So still in the rebuilding phase or building phase.
That makes sense. Yeah, that's really interesting. That's probably one thing we should consider is separating out our beef into a couple different, what I call beef, but it's really our livestock, our animal numbers into a couple different pots so that we can track them individually. Sort of similar to what you were talking about with the equipment. You want to see for each piece of equipment hours versus cost. And right now we have all of our costs for medicine going in for everything.
Yep.
But maybe if we were smart, we would actually be able to break it out by species and part of the market. So our animals that are going to go and sold, at a post-weaning point versus those that are finished should be on two different books.
And we're able to keep it because mom does a lot of the purchasing for the cattle. Fatima does a lot of the purchasing, so my sister-in-law does a lot of purchasing for the goats, and so that's
Right.
they're able to. And the hay is the one aspect where we have to keep it separate. So the
Right.
goats aren't using a lot of hay, so we actually, this past fall bought dedicated hay bales for the goats, so it'd be completely separate from the cattle and store it in a different barn. So it's like this is the goat hay, and the rest is going to be for the cattle. So we had it separated and allocated so each one would be easier to say, this is what the goats use, this is the cattle, so there's no confusion.
Well, when you sell, let me ask you this, because you sell bulls.
Yep.
When you sell bulls, how do you handle that with your record books? Do you have that as like a different line item than selling commercial calves, or does all that money get into one pot and you don't really look at breeding stock versus? I mean, I guess it depends on how long you hold the animal because tax-wise.
All right. For a lot of those, I guess it all goes on they'll be on the same. We have an Excel sheet, so we break it down by any our sales for the I guess little stockers.
Mm-hmm.
So anytime we sell those, they're all usually on a separate sheet. So they're like, here's how we did for them and the number that we sold. Here's how we did for our bulls, and then we all usually have a separate one for the cow calf pairs. We'll probably put in actual cattle sales. Here's how we did add the cattle sales and a little bit of meat sales, but not a whole lot.
Right.
Just because we're again spread too thin to actually focus and make that an effective part of our operation. We do have separate one for our goat meat sales. So we have goat meat sales, which will be a surprising. We do fairly well with that. So any ones which are looking, any ones we think that okay they're good right now, but maybe they're not the most productive, or they might get more problems than we think they should have for foot rot or something like that. They'll be the ones who are on the first on the chopping block, and then we'll sell that meat and do fairly well with that. Have a good recovery value.
Good. Okay, well that's really interesting. Yeah, always trying to ask questions and figure out ways to be a little bit more effective with the record keeping. I mean, I think most people know that we're pretty adamant about record keeping as decision making is so critical on the farms. But I at a time like this, at this time of the year when we really reflect and we're getting ready to do our taxes and things like that, this is a great time of year to really take a good hard look at where money was spent in a year and then what you would like to spend money on this year. That's sort of, for us, what we're doing right now is just what money do we want to spend, and where can we spend money and how much are we willing to spend,
Yes.
and how much do we expect that we're also going to be spending on things like repairs and things like that if we're being honest and realistic with ourselves.
Yeah, and for us, you talked about essentially the proposed budget. We're trying to think about, we had three options. So with the cattle, with the challenges we had this past year as far as hay production, do we spend, do we invest more in fertilizer potentially? Do we invest more in fertilizer to get the return better yields? Do we sell some animals to reduce the number of animals that we have, spend the same amount? Are kind of our two main options. Like, do we sell animals and have it adjust, match our animals to hay, or we increase our hay to match our animals?
Yeah.
And so, thinking about the fertilizer and return on investment, where do we focus?
Yeah.
Or do we just potentially buy hay?
Yep. I think buying hay has to be an option on the table at this point. It is painful to purchase and it's
Yep.
higher than it was, but I still think that there are times that you can purchase it cheaper than you can make it.
Yes.
And when I say times, I mean here in Kentucky a lot of the time.
Yep.
It is hard to pay sometimes to get out the value
For the nutrients and the ownership cost and the
Exactly.
operating cost.
Yep. So interesting. I sort of, we're like you, we try and figure that balance all the time. I mean, we're committed to some fertilizer because of the types of hay that we sell, but we also are committed to purchasing hay. We continue to try and find new sources of hay.
Yeah.
Reliable sources of hay that are of an acceptable quality, that we're comfortable with them for our cattle, even if they're not necessarily available to others. But it's a fine balancing act, and every year we have to make the decision about how much hay we want to have on hand, how much hay we want to have at the end of the year. That's one of our decisions right now. How much hay are we willing to sell out of what's still in the barns? What margin do we think is too tight?
Yeah.
When hay is this tight, we will sell most of our barns down. We tried to buy enough hay to have 100 to 200 extra bales, but I doubt that we will end the winter with more than 50 extra bales. If winter ends very early, that would not be a bad thing, and we are holding a little bit more hay than we expect. I will be okay with that.
Yep.
But I don't want to be too cautious that I leave money on the table, because this was a tight year and we paid pretty dearly for the hay that we have. So we want to make sure that we sell enough of it to justify the payments that we make. So that's sort of where we're at right now. Let's do a quick recap what's happening on the farm next week. Let's give them all of our goals that are not going to happen here, Josh.
So we need to clean out the barn again. I don't think that's going to happen. If it was dry Friday, Saturday, oh man, we'd be set and be spread of manure. But I think it's going to rain Friday, maybe possibly rain Saturday, so we might not get that done. So still putting out hay, working on some equipment, just basic equipment maintenance. Probably getting ready for changing fuel filters, changing air filters, just going through the basics maintenance. Hopefully get done, but there's other stuff going on. So nephew has a basketball game, so I might go to that.
There you go. You got to spend time with family. That's important. Yeah,
Yep.
we will be feeding animals, of course. We will be working on equipment. We have a farm truck that has a starter that needs replaced. Shouldn't be a huge problem, but just all these little projects, these little time sinks out there. And then we have to clean off a pad.
Okay.
So we cleaned it before the cold, and actually just in the process, sort of in the middle of the rain. So it's a little sloppy. It's drying out, but this is a good time to push it before it gets too dry, but also to allow a little bit to build up before more cold weather comes in.
More cold and rain. Interesting stuff happens again.
There could always be more interesting stuff to happen. Plus putting out some hay on the farm where we do some bale grazing, getting that reset up for the next set of weather. That's maybe a today, tomorrow.
Then in the future, next week, getting ready for the fun times of Farm Show.
That's right. We will be at Farm Show next week.
14th.
14th through the 17th? 16th. 17th. Yeah. We should be there throughout that time. A little bit of information that we're going to have on off-grid solar calculation, sizing a solar system, backup generator.
like a brand new Matt Dixon display his brand new weather app.
Yeah, I'm really excited about the weather app. I have it on my phone. It seems to be working reasonably well, which is nice. I'm sure he's going to be happy to hear that. I'm unhappy with how it doesn't just like scream at me in the middle of the night for no reason. And I'm hesitant to put some apps on my phone for exactly that reason. But
Yes,
it seems to be a really nice new for anyone that wants some weather alerts in the state.
I think he's still doing some fine tuning, but once he's going to add the ag weather data here soon, so that's what I'm really excited for.
Make it all streamlined.
That point ag forecast on there.
Yep, and I think that's a good summary for today, and we will be back hopefully without technical difficulties next week with another new podcast.
Take care, everybody.
Have You Heard is a production of the University of Kentucky College of Agriculture, Food and Environment, along with the Department of Biosystems and Agricultural Engineering. Discover what's wildly possible at ca.uky.edu.